Hello there, I'm Aidan Hogg and I'm from Imperial College London. And we'll start by asking you a question. Imagine if I was to give you a meeting room recording. Probably quite hard to imagine a meeting nowadays with COVID, but imagine that you had this recording of a physical meeting with multiple people present, and I asked you how many speakers were in that meeting and who was speaking at what time. Could you answer that just using the recording? I'm pretty sure with near 100% accuracy, you'd find that task quite easy to solve. But it's actually a task that computers find extremely difficult. It's called speaker diarization. It's working out who spoke when. And why is it so useful? Well, besides the obvious of being able to label speakers in an audio recording, it's also useful for ASR, automatic speech recognition, because if you can separate out the individual speakers, then you can run your ASR algorithm on the speakers individually, which means that you can improve the performance because it can adapt to the individual speakers. So how do we do speaker diarization? What are the steps involved? Well, it's normally split into two components, what's called segmentation and clustering. The clustering step is where we start with a normal speech signal, and then we put in these vertical bars to basically do the segmentation. And that's when speaker change boundaries occur. That's when one speaker turns into another speaker. The next step, or the second step, is we cluster. So we basically cluster certain speakers together because they're the same speaker. Here you can see I've coloured them in green and blue, green relating to one speaker and the blue colour relating to the other speaker. Now in this work we're going to focus on that sort of segmentation step, putting in those vertical lines. And you might ask, why is that important relative to the clustering step? Because actually there's a lot of algorithms out there now that uniformly segment, so they just segment maybe in two second segments, and then you can cluster, and if two segments are of the same speaker, they'll surely just be merged together. And then maybe you have some realignment problems because obviously uniformly segmenting won't fall on speaker change boundaries, but you can do a realignment step, so that's quite easy to solve. And the main issue with that approach is that you just have less information. If you've only got 2 seconds of speech, it's quite hard to know what speaker is actually talking. Even a human with that amount of speech would find it quite difficult. Whereas if you've got sort of 15 seconds, because that's how long the speaker is talking for, you've got a lot more speech to work with when you're trying to cluster that particular bit of speech and associate it with a particular speaker. So it's always worthwhile trying to get that segmentation step correct. And in this work, we're going to look at how can we do that using spatial and acoustic features. That means using direction of arrival and using sort of pitch features of someone's voice. Why do we need both? Well, because you can imagine in a meeting room, if two people are speaking, they might have very similar pitches. Maybe they're of the same gender and they just have a very similar style of speaking. So when one speaker stops and a new speaker starts, their pitches are very similar. So it's quite hard to differentiate speaker changes just looking at their pitch. But maybe in the room they're sitting in two different locations, so their azimuth, or the angle at which their speech hits the microphone, is different. So that way we can use the direction of arrival, that spatial information. But now imagine that you have one speaker that's standing behind a whiteboard, or standing behind a speaker working on a whiteboard. That azimuth and the speaker they're standing in front of will be the same. So those two speakers will have very similar angle in terms of how their speech hits the microphone array. So now you actually need to look at something else because the azimuth won't help you. And in that case, maybe we can use the pitch. So you've got these two cases. You've got maybe two speakers have similar pitches, but do they necessarily have the same azimuth? Are they sitting in the same place? Or maybe if they are in the same place, do they have a different pitch? And in this work, we actually track the harmonics rather than just the fundamental frequency. And the benefit of that is even if the azimuth is not different and two speakers are speaking at the same time, we've actually discovered in past papers that you can still work out that there's two speakers looking at the harmonic structure of that voice speech, because when they overlap, the actual peaks that you'll see in the spectrum won't be harmonically related, because you'll actually be seeing both sort of the superposition of the two speakers' harmonics together. So how do we track these speakers individually? Well, we first need to start off by formulating this. So this is the proposed architecture, and as you can see, it has those two components. It has the pitch, and it also has the DOA. And we start off by actually working out how we can track this using a Kalman filter. So we first have a state space. Actually at the bottom you can see it's an X, and that contains the fundamental frequency and the DOA estimate for that particular frame. And then we have an observation, but the observation obviously contains all the harmonics and the DOA. So that's why we have a vector F and then a single scalar value D, which is the direction of the arrival for the observation Z. How do we relate those two together? Well, we have a particular matrix called H, and as you can see we've got this lowercase h. The lowercase h value is just the basically the harmonic plus 1. So you can imagine if it's the fundamental, that needs to be 1, because then you're timesing x by 1 to get z, which is the fundamental. But then if it's the first harmonic, then you multiply it by 2, so x multiplied by 2 gives you the first harmonic in the z observation, and so on and so forth. Obviously the DOA is just the same for the observation and the state space, so that's why we have a little 1 on the second row in the last column. So that's how we relate the DOA the observations and the state space. We also need to think about how do we model it. Well, actually, if we just go back and look at that previous slide, you can see that we model it using a random walk, and we have this sort of noise term, which is normally called the process noise, given by Q. And then we do 2 steps for any Kalman filter. We do a prediction step and an update step. And the important thing to note is the prediction step we run on every single frame. And what that's doing is we're just saying that the pitch as the current frame is exactly the same as the pitch at the previous frame, and the DOA again, the pitch at the current frame is exactly the same as the DOA of the previous frame. We're basically saying the state space is the same for both frames. And we also have this P, this covariance, which says how accurate do we think our model is. And because we're running that on every frame, if we were to only run the prediction, obviously P would get much greater, saying that it's becoming less and less reliable, this model. And as you can imagine, if you're just propagating the same state, it's not going to be very reliable after a period of time has passed. So we run that on every step, but then what we do is we also run an update step, which corrects the prediction and also reduces the covariance. Conceptually, you can imagine that as if you've seen lots of observations in very quick succession, the model is going to be very accurate. So if you get something that's way off in your observation, it's almost likely to be wrong. So you don't want to rely too much on that observation. You want to rely more on the model. But if you haven't seen an observation for a long, long period of time, and then you get a new observation, the model is probably completely wrong because it's just been running by propagating the previous state that it saw last. So we want to rely more on the observation. And that's basically what this Kalman gain component does. So if it's all ones, which would be an extreme case, it would just rely on the observation. And if it was all zeros, it would just rely on the previous, well, basically the model, so the previous state. And normally it wouldn't be 1 or 0, that vector. It would actually be a value, and then you can trade off the two. So we can work out how reliable we think it is based on when we last saw a measurement. To give you an idea of what that would look like, if we just thought about pitch and we just looked at the variance, you can see that the variance in P, in the covariance, would just increase as you're not seeing any measurements. But then when you see some voice speech and you start getting some observations, that variance then decreases. Obviously this is just looking at the pitch, but if we were to look at the DOA, you would see exactly the same thing, and that would make up, those two variances would make up your covariance in the model. So now we've got this Kalman filter that's tracking these two components simultaneously. How do we actually deal with all the tracks that we're going to be generating? Because at each time frame we get lots of observations, and we'd want to generate a new track for all of those observations. And then as we go through, for every existing track, we would want to update it with all the new observations and generate, again, new tracks for those particular observations. To solve that problem, we use multi-hypothesis tracking. So you can see here we've got a tree structure. At every single time frame, we generate a new track for all observations, and we basically update all existing tracks. And we also assume that all the measurements or observations are wrong, which gives us an X, and we just run the prediction step. So you can see that this grows exponentially very fast. And it gives us lots and lots of options to choose from for different tracks. So you can see that number 1 is some observations in the top diagram, and then number 2 shows you one possible way of joining them together as a track, and then 3 shows you a different way, which is actually better. And that's basically how can we select which tracks we like. Why is 3, in this case, better? And the reason we say that is because when we generate a track, we obviously have estimation errors, and that's the errors between the observations that we saw and what the model said, well, what we basically ended up picking in our state space. And that difference gives us an error called the estimation error. And if a track was made up of lots of estimation errors, so when we generated the track, if it had lots of estimation errors on average, had a very high estimation error, then we say that was a poor track. Whereas if the observations very closely followed the actual track that was generated, then we'd say that had a very low estimation error on average, so that was a better track. And what we use is something called the maximally weighted clique. So each track is a node, it's given a weight based on those estimation errors, and we want to minimize basically those errors. And what we've done is we've drawn a line between every track that doesn't conflict. So if a track conflicts, then obviously it can't exist with the other track that it conflicts with. And why would a track conflict? Because it basically contains the same observations as another track. So two tracks can't use the same observation in the same frame. They have to use different observations. So although we're creating lots and lots of tracks, most of the tracks conflict, and using this maximum weighted clique method, we can remove those tracks at certain intervals of time, sort of periodic intervals. We can trim away or prune away those tracks and be left with the ones that best fit the data that we see. So why don't we have a look at an illustrative example on the Amy Corpus. The Amy Corpus is basically a meeting room environment. You can see it has a circular array in the center of the table, which is what we use for the DOA, and the pitch we obviously just use one microphone, or I should say the harmonics to get those, we just use one microphone. And if we take a small section of Amy, which has some overlapping speech, so we have 2 speakers, a female one and a male one, and sometimes they're overlapping, so between 1 second and 2 seconds there's some overlap, and also in 11 to 12 seconds there's a change in speaker, there's some silence, and then the speaker starts, and then some more silence. This diagram shows the estimates that we get for the DOA in the top, and the estimates we get for the pitch. Now if we were to just track those individually, using our same method, but we basically just ignore, we don't track them simultaneously, we basically augment the state so it just has one of those variables, then this is what we would get. And as you can see, it quite closely fits the data we see, but it's not very accurate. The DOA is obviously a lot more accurate, but the tracks are just slightly too short. If you notice that between 1 and 2 seconds where that overlapping speech happens, the second speaker, M73, his track is just a bit too small. And again we see that the same at 11 seconds, don't we, that F72, the track is again very short. And obviously the pitch tracks, you're getting lots and lots of false alarms because the track keeps breaking because it thinks that it's a different speaker because the pitches vary so much. So if we just took the start and the end of each track as a sort of start and end of each speaker, this is the result we would get. And as you can see, we got lots of false alarms, and the DOA actually is missing a particular change. So why don't we try and track them simultaneously? And as you can see, that massively improves things. Not only does it extend the tracks for the DOA to the correct length, it also stops all these breaks in the pitch, because obviously the state space is tracking both of those together. So if the DOA is continuing, even when the pitch is not, maybe because there's unvoiced speech, it can track over those intervals using the DOA information, which is really helpful. And now if we look at how it generates the sort of start and end points of the tracks, it's much better in this particular example. So why don't we look at a statistical analysis across the whole corpus, and we start to see that actually for all meetings, the proposed method actually does seem to get a better hit rate. Not massively better, and in some meetings it's worse, but it seems to be slightly better. But where we start to see a bigger improvement is in the false alarm rate. So you can see that the bottom bold line is the proposed method, and as you can see that is much lower, the false alarm rate for the proposed method, versus tracking these two features separately. We have included a BLSTM baseline, and that's actually just highlight that we get sort of similar performance, but actually what we're seeing is a trade-off here, because the BLSTM gets a worse hit rate, but a much lower false alarm rate. So you have to trade off. If you make the system more sensitive, you'll get more hits but more false alarms. If you make the system less sensitive, then you'll get less hits and less false alarms. False alarms normally matter less because you can imagine if you over-segment, you can cluster back together. But if you under-segment, that's quite difficult. And then the mean rates across these sort of three features. And the new feature, just to highlight, is this multi-hit rate. So how often do we detect a speaker change more than once? And you can see that for the proposed method, that's actually right down. So it actually is very rare that you'll detect multiple times the same speaker change. So the contributions of this paper is we've proposed a new way of tracking these two features simultaneously using multiple hypothesis tracking, and we've also shown that actually we can achieve better performance by tracking them simultaneously than tracking the DOA or the fundamental frequency separately. Thank you for listening. Please do email me if you have any questions.